work. Making Melbourne and its hinterland work is essentially about making the Victorian economy work. One of the other things we probably don't necessarily appreciate is that we've had in this country over the last 3 decades, notwithstanding changes in the texture of the governments and whether they be Labor or Liberal, we've actually had continuity of policy essentially both at the national and at the state level. In the 80s we had the first wave which opened up the Australian economy to greater international competition. The second wave was very much focused on internal competition policy and a whole range of public administration reforms, and we're currently in a very halting way, very much focused on the importance of investing in human capital. And it's been driven essentially on a bipartisan basis. Now, I can't emphasise the importance of that. The importance of policy continuity, notwithstanding nuances, has enabled Australia to be transformed and to be, on balance, transformed for the better. I spend a lot of time travelling in the United States. I actually always go to the United States because it's got the best of the best and the worst of the worst. And one of the things you do see in the United States, and it always comes back as a contrast to me, is just how little continuity there has been in terms of thinking about public policy, how little investment there has been in terms of issues around governance, and I suspect some of the challenges in some of the larger American cities relates in part to the fragmentation of governance and the lack of clarity about who does what. One of the big advantages we do have here in Australia is that, for better or for worse, most of the levers for urban development actually sit at one level of government. And whilst we can have some debate about the balance of responsibilities between state and local government, and occasionally the federal government becomes a player in this space, hopefully more so in terms of funding, essentially at state government level we find all the levers of urban development. Whether it's done well or not is something that is obviously debatable, but it's a huge competitive advantage that we have, and it's something we should be very beware of giving up lightly. So just in terms of thinking about some broad policy frameworks against the context in which I've outlined, I've spoken to you about the role of the department and the conceptual underpinnings of it, set against some of the challenges of urban development in the context of Victoria essentially being a networked economy between Melbourne and the regions. There was an attempt by the Premier earlier this year at the Australian Davos Connection Cities Summit to try and encapsulate what the vision was for Melbourne and its regions. And he did so by talking about a livability pledge, which essentially outlined what is essentially the key strategic directions of the government. And I think you can see that in terms of the various elements that are identified in this livability pledge, coming out of that, to do it well, placemaking is very much at the centre of that. And I think that certainly from the perspective of the various government agencies that are involved in this enterprise, the notion of livability, or the way it's described, I think provides some very key signposts for us. Livability is actually quite a clunky concept, and when you actually sort of test it with people, I think people in this audience would probably understand it, but most people understand it as quality of life. And when Melburnians get asked what it is they like about the city, or what it is they like about living in Melbourne, they talk about quality of life. And I think livability, although, as I say, the audience for this is probably more inside rather than outside, what it really means is addressing the issues outlined in this so-called livability pledge are very much about enhancing the quality of life of Victorians. So very quickly, and this will be understood by many of you, most of the policy work over the last decade, but particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, building on Melbourne 2030, has been about integrating land use and transport planning. The fact that we had to spend a fair bit of time talking about the integration of land use and transport planning, the fact that there was necessary to have a deep conversation in government and outside government about the importance of linking the two is, I guess, a sense of how much we've forgotten about where we came from. Because understanding the importance of the two and how they shape the city and how they can be used both to shape cities and, in a sense, to create the backbone and the context for good placemaking is something that the people who built this city in its first 50, 60, 70 years understood intrinsically. And James Kunstler's little photograph of Collins Street in the early part of this century is, I think, an indication. One of the insights in relation to, or one of the core commitments in relation to Melbourne at 5 million was the movement of Melbourne from a monocentric to a polycentric city. And Carol, you mentioned Memphis and the failure in Memphis because they moved from a monocentric to a polycentric city, and I can certainly understand the comments you made about it being a city that moved from 500 to 650,000. We're a city now of 4 million, and we're a city that will grow to 6 million. So the need to move into and to do the investments to create what we call central activity districts in places where people live is really about providing them with the amenity and the jobs that those of us who live within proximity of the CBD take for granted. And that's a huge challenge. And it's a challenge that I think, notwithstanding it's been adopted as core government policy, and in one sense the development was occurring in its own right, it's a challenge that probably we don't understand the full implications of. One of the reasons why there is this focus on moving to a polycentric city gets to a core of a point I'd like to make, which I think we absolutely need to understand. It's almost an existential point. That is, Melbourne is quintessentially a suburban metropolis. It's not a European city, and in many ways, when people value the quality of life in Melbourne, what they're saying is they value the quality of suburban life. And I disagree with your comment, James, that it's sort of derived from an Anglo-American model and that the suburbs are dead boring. That might be a view. It's not a view shared by the people who want to live in this city. That's not to say that we've done suburban development as well as we could everywhere. But the notion that somehow we, in a sense, devalue the importance of suburban life means that the conversations we have will not resonate with the vast majority of people who live in this city. And I guess it's probably one of my observations about the so-called public policy debate that's occurring is that it's very much driven, I have to say, by elites, and I count myself within that, elites who think about suburban life from the perspective of the inner and middle areas. This is not the life experience of most people who aspire to suburban life in this state. It's also, I think, important to say that this is not a marginal issue. The importance of suburban life and the value people place on suburban life is sort of deeply embedded in the civic values that we hold. And it cuts across the political spectrum. There's a lot of young people here, so they may not remember that we had a Prime Minister called Robert Menzies. And Robert Menzies used to talk about the forgotten people. And much of the public policy of the Menzies era, as it related to urban development, was about ensuring that people that essentially what we would sometimes call, or what are sometimes called the working class, actually got access to a quality of life that the middle class has always had. And that trail has worked its way right through the public policy since that time, whether it's Men and Women of Australia, whether it's Howard's Battlers, whether it's whether it's RUDs, working families, this is actually a core aspiration. And I guess I'd say that unless we understand that, and unless our public policy can accommodate the challenges of growth within that framework, then essentially we don't have a framework within which to operate.